Welcome, TV historians, to Advanced TV Herstory. We have a very fun interview today with a past guest. We are welcoming April Smith to talk, here it is, in pandemic 2020 about some of the projects that she has going on, as well as do a little bit of an in-depth look at that whole hashtag #MeToo and how it's been depicted on the small screen over the years. We are continuing to learn things about feminism, and this is a fantastic crossroads, actually, that we find ourselves at in this talk with April Smith, because she has had such a lengthy career writing the very words that bring to the screen the idea of equality and opportunity and talented women who deserve every chance to succeed, as we give men today. So with that, April Smith, welcome to Advanced TV Herstory.
Delighted to be here, Cynthia. Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners, you should know that this was actually supposed to probably happen in person, but as shelter in place came to be, we had to modify the calendar, and so here we are. Listeners, if you've had the chance to watch FX Hulu's Mrs. America, you will perhaps see as the credits roll by that April Smith is a consulting producer. I don't even know what a consulting producer is in this day and age, so we're going to hear from April about what that is, what she did, and perhaps some experiences behind the scenes of this very fascinating feminist take on recent American history.
Working on Mrs. America was a privilege. It was highly competitive to be hired on that show. It came with a gold standard. The executive producer and creator is Davi Waller, who came up from Mad Men. And I really wanted that job because I had lived through the time that we portrayed on the screen. In fact, I was the only one in the room who had lived through it. So finally, we can find an advantage in our age. So a consulting producer is in the writer's room. I am a writer and producer. And so I was there for what we call breaking stories, which meant, in this case, learning, integrating, and understanding the stories of every one of those characters in real life. Gloria Steinem and Phyllis Schlafly and Shirley Chisholm and all those luminaries. It was a crash course in feminism. I learned a lot of things I didn't know. But the challenge in terms of writing was to integrate all of that into a dramatic narrative. And it was really brain busting, I'll tell you. But I think we did a fantastic job, and the production values on this show are just breathtaking. When you see it, Cate Blanchett has just embodied Phyllis Schlafly in a very luminous way. She doesn't play her as evil. We didn't write her as evil. We wrote her in 3 dimensions. And Cate said she took the role because she wanted to know who Phyllis was, to understand that person. And that was our journey too, to get through our own preconceptions from, coming from, at least most of us, a liberal, well, all of us, a liberal feminist background, to look at this personage and understand how she operated, which was brilliant. She was one of the great strategists in politics. And she invented the moral majority because she understood that you needed an army to face an army. And she created an army by uniting all these church groups and grassroots women, which in the end completely single-handedly defeated the ERA. So it's an anti-hero story from our point of view. But, from other people's point of view, she was a hero. And so that was the challenge, to portray her in 3 dimensions.
I look forward to the remaining episodes as this sort of evolves. The one thing, even from watching the first episode or from knowing anything about Phyllis Schlafly, is that her name is largely forgotten in terms of the paragons of the right-wing movement. The men have pretty handily whisked her name aside, and all that she did in the trenches, and as you all depicted in the first episode, even, she really was in many ways put in her place and could have been much more powerful. So fascinating look at political leadership in the not that distant past. So,
Mm-hmm.
you're
Well,
doing
yes,
great work.
and the paradox is in the first episode, you see her in those rooms with men like we all have been, where they are condescending. They tell her to smile, quote, with teeth when she goes on TV, and she just wipes them out with her knowledge of, in this case, nuclear armament, which was her
Mm-hmm.
specialty,
Mm-hmm.
before she pivoted into this leadership against the ERA. And you see her evolve as a politician and as a very ambitious woman, wanting her own power and finding where it was and making the most of it. So she is kind of a role model in that way.
And very resourceful. An
Mm-hmm.
understanding that you really don't make big things happen by just sitting around. That is fascinating. And maybe after the whole series is done, we will have to come back and revisit everything so that we are not in the middle of divulging spoilers and an incomplete story as it's been shared. But congratulations on that and for being
Thank
such
you.
a key contributor to an important opportunity to tell a story with the cast that it has. Tracy Ullman. I mean, anything with Tracy Ullman, anything with Helena Bonham Carter I just can't wait. And they are show stealers and scene stealers. So Mrs. America, everybody, on Hulu, however you can find it. Sit down, recognize that it's largely factual. I mean, would you call it historic fiction, April?
Oh, there's no fiction in it. Well, there's one character who is a fictional conglomerate of people, but no, trust me, it is factually accurate. That was the killer in writing this, is everything had to be real and documented. So yeah, it's factual.
And they show magazine covers and those were real. And then of course,
Mm-hmm.
so there are lots of little nuances that certainly lend to the credibility. And the wardrobe is stunning. So
Mm-hmm.
that must have been fun to see evolve in the whole project. Oh gosh.
Well, the production values are brilliant. The music, the way it's integrated as a piece of art, I think is going to be very appealing to everybody. But for anyone who's lived through it or is curious about feminism, I think you're going to really love it. The reactions I've been getting from friends are through the roof.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just ask one more question then, because I don't have the list of credited crew in front of me, was
Mm-hmm.
it mostly written by women?
The writing room was very diverse. There were, yes, it was all women of all different backgrounds, Asian, African American. There was one male in the room, well, two. One was a researcher and one was a writer. And so basically, yeah, it was women and women running the show. But from that diverse point of view, which I think was crucial in telling this story, because the women in it are diverse.
And that was especially important because, again, listeners, as we're trying not to reveal too much, it is premised, the entire 9 episodes are premised on the lives of Shirley Chisholm, Phyllis Schlafly, and Gloria Steinem. Shirley Chisholm, of course, holding a very special place in African American history for all of her political and cultural accomplishments.
Right. Well, she's the star of episode 3, and I think it's very touching what happened to her and infuriating.
Well, it's keeping us alive, and it's a salute to the resistance, I guess.
Yes.
Speaking of the resistance, okay, so listeners, as you may have been tuning in over the past year or so, I've been doing a little bit of an in-depth look at the hashtag #MeToo subject matter as it's been portrayed and depicted in both dramas and comedies for the last 4 or 5 decades, give or take. You might have had a chance to listen to the episode that I did on That Girl, a couple of episodes actually on That Girl, where, Anne-Marie got into some situations and how those writers handled those situations told an awful lot about the time in which it was put on TV, the late 60s, early 70s. Similarly, we talked about Sports Night and an episode on there where in the 1990, 2000, Natalie and Dana had to wrestle with the moral implications of a quid pro quo, sending Natalie off to get a story in what could be a very risky, potentially harassing sort of situation. And in sort of spinning the dial, as it were, I guess I was in contact with you, April, and I was sort of sending some ideas back and forth, and you sent me back, then you need to go find the episode Harassment, which, listeners, is on YouTube. Here's the thing, is you too can watch the episode that we're about to talk about because it's really important. And so, actually, my connection to April goes back to the fact that she was one of the women writers in the room writing the very acclaimed TV series Lou Grant. So let's pick up that conversation about the Lou Grant Writers' Room. I know we covered it a bit in our earlier conversation, but what was that room like? Oh, gosh. And even you could compare it a little bit to the room you've just exited with Mrs. America.
Lou Grant was run by three men who were very enlightened about just about everything. Gene Reynolds, Alan Burns, and Seth Freeman were running the ship when I came on in the 80s. And they were very generous in including us, the young folks, in learning everything, not only about writing for TV, but TV production. Gene Reynolds, in particular, was one of the kindest, most inclusive men I've ever met. He recently passed away, which is very sad and a real loss. In the room, there were two women, me and Michelle Gallery, and then Steve Klein. We were the writers, the young writers, and then Alan Burns and Seth Freeman were the writers in charge, and then Gene ran the show. And we had a woman researcher and, of course, women secretaries who were crucial to getting our words down because we did not have computers. We had a whiteboard. We would all break the stories together. This was Gene's method and one that I took with me when I went on to produce Cagney and Lacey. So we all sat together and we broke the scripts down into 4 acts because these were 1-hour shows with 4 acts for commercials. And so there was a real form to creating the scripts. And that was very helpful. It wasn't free form like doing a movie. And that the restrictions paradoxically gave you freedom because you had to work within that. So I was the rookie, and Gene would not only run the room, but he had me learn all the aspects of TV production, from editing. I would sit with editors, to casting. I'd be in the casting sessions, to the set. We'd walk the set, we'd talk with the set designers, to the cast readings, which were essential when all the actors would sit around the table and read the script before we shot it, meeting with directors. So I left Lou Grant with a skill set that I was able to take to Cagney and Lacey and then forward to other movies of the week. Fast forward to the room at Mrs. America, which actually functioned in the same way. You sit around the table, you become very intimate with the other writers, their lives, their quirks. And we had, not only on Mrs. America, there was so much information. We didn't have one whiteboard. I think we had 6. Honestly, the walls were plastered with whiteboards, and just for fun, sometimes we'd use a bulletin board so we could put pins in the cards. That was thrilling.
Old school, even older
Old
school. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So the process was the same. On Lou Grant, though, we were motivated by telling the truth, in the sense that newspapers tell the truth. It was about a newspaper. So every story, every episode had to involve a news story that was breaking in the Trib, that the Trib was covering. And that was the way Harassment, my episode, was structured. When I rewatched it, I was very impressed by the fact that it really had forward motion. The episode begins with a guy trying to run over somebody with his truck. You see an unknown person taking out his garbage on an ordinary street, and then you're in the point of view of this truck that is trying to run him over. Oh, great. What is that about? Well, it turns out that that's a story that comes to the Trib about the guy in the truck who's trying to kill this guy. It's taking out his garbage because that guy is the boss of our truck driver's wife. And the wife has been complaining that he has been bothering her at work. So it starts from the point of view of an enraged husband who doesn't want this other man messing with his wife. And that is only one of, I don't know, maybe 5 storylines that run through that one episode. And in the end, toward you weave him in and out, the guy in the truck crashes and ends up in the hospital. So you weave in and out of his story with his wife and her sense of harassment from her own boss, to the Trib covering the story, to the story broadening out. So the reporter, Billy Newman, is assigned to look at harassment within her own workplace at the Trib. So that is how we widen the story. I got to tell multiple points of view about the story. That was the brilliance of Lou Grant.
It is a very tightly woven and tightly written episode. You really see it from as many different perspectives as you're able to fit into the whatever that would have been 49 minutes or 52 minutes that was allowed back in.
Yeah, it was 1980.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Listeners, to prepare for this interview with April, in addition to watching the episode twice, I also went back to my bookshelf and found a tremendous book from 1996 written by Douglas K. Daniel, and it's entitled Lou Grant, The Making of TV's Top Newspaper Drama. If you weren't around back in the 80s, or you don't really like to watch YouTube because Lou Grant really never made it to DVD the way it should have, Lou Grant was a spinoff of Mary Tyler Moore Show, Lou being Mary's boss in that sitcom in a TV journalistic environment. And spinning that show off to a 60-minute drama was a bit of a stretch. And so the way Douglas Daniel tells it in the book, as in recounting interviews that he conducted with all of the folks that April has named and many others, he reveals that, they really were very disciplined to include a certain level of storytelling about journalism and the industry and the moral, some of the ethical questions that take place on the backside, that they also delved into social issues pretty much on a weekly basis, and that then there was also a human interest aspect. And so even as April is just kind of revealing the layers that she had to bring together in order to present this story, you can see how it fits into a bit of a formula without at all seeming formulaic. And when we think of formulaic today, we think of SVU and Bones and some of those. That was not the case at all with Lou Grant because the subject matter was so incredibly different week to week.
Correct.
Getting back to harassment, however, so there you were, fresh into the industry as a writer. And how is it that back then, before the day of the internet, how did you end up really doing the level of research that undoubtedly was much easier on Mrs. America, but how did you do that research about sexual harassment?
Well, on the staff of Lou Grant, we had a full-time researcher, and her job was to read every newspaper, every magazine, and clip stories that had potential for us to develop. The genesis for harassment, I know it was handed to me from the producers. They said, let's do a story on sexual harassment in the workplace. But the research for it came from that sort of 24/7 eye on what was breaking in the news at the time. So I didn't know what the definition of it was. I had to learn that. And of course, the original definition is, as you mentioned, is a quid quo pro at that time, meaning that it wasn't considered sexual harassment unless there was a deal that was made between the harasser and the victim. Something like, if you don't sleep with me, you don't do what I'm asking you to do, you will be fired. Now, since then, the definition has broadened out so that now the definition is more like it's considered sexual harassment in the workplace if these parameters have interfered with a person's job or created an offensive work environment or have intimidated the employee or victim, which is great because the subtlety of it sometimes is something that's elusive, as we've seen in recent trials. But at the time, that was it. So it was a little bit tricky to portray dramatically that standard for sexual harassment, at the same time making it identifiable in human terms in the fact that it often is more subtle than that. So again, in the episode, there are many different examples of it. And what I really love about the episode is that there are many examples and many different outcomes. One of them that I love the most is that even though the Trib goes ahead and starts a sort of awareness program about harassment at the newspaper, the atmosphere doesn't change. And toward the end, you still see the guys in the back of the newsroom laughing in their, quote, male way. You don't know exactly what, but there's still that sense of the old boys club continuing. And even the main harasser of the episode gets away with it. So that's real.
It is real. And the 2 points, I guess, that just occurred to me as you were making that sort of description of the difficulty in bringing forward something that we know exists in the workplace. You are under a certain amount of pressure to make this entertaining, not just a whack on the head with a baseball bat for all of American manhood. That does not translate into change. Change is through education, and it's through awareness building. That was definitely something that I watched in this episode as an adult that I don't know that I necessarily would have seen when I was in high school and watched it. But I think as a teen viewer watching it, it might have occurred to me that the workplace was a little bit more of a minefield or a little bit more combative, and that it did come with a certain amount of risk for me as a young woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I am hard-pressed to see that level of interest in young people's understanding of the human condition in current TV offerings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you know why? Because it's hard. It's hard, Cynthia, to get it all done. And as you said earlier, formula is easy to do. And so, when you're pressured for output, sometimes you revert to what is easier. Each one of these Lou Grant episodes was invented from scratch. Each one was a short story in its own way. The characters remained consistent. But as Gene used to say, we need to turn the characters. I love that expression. He would say, turn the characters so you see all sides of them.
Mm-hmm.
But when I came on the show, that was established. So it all comes back to character. And that's often what's missing in these generic shows, like zero character, just sort of generic roles.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about this, wow, the parallels here with the recent experience you've had with Mrs. America, it makes this a very fun interview to conduct. But going back a minute then to line up this harassment episode with many others that you wrote for the Lou Grant series over years, did this one come across, or do you have any memory of it being more controversial than some of the other episodes, including Strike, which you wrote, which was critically acclaimed and won awards? Did it resonate? Did you get letters, or did Linda Kelsey get letters?
I think it was received with the same respect that most of the episodes were. I think people expected this kind of thing from Lou Grant to be groundbreaking, which we were. So I think the harassment episode was just part of the trip that you went on when you watched the Grant.
And what we will never know for sure, because it was before the internet and before people could tweet about it, is the impact that it had on the lives of women who were in the workplace and living this, that they maybe had conversations the next morning and maybe found in the form of representation of the various women who were the victims or the subject of the harassment, who are brought forth into this little story, their situations and their points of view, and even how then the men who are involved in advancing this story forward so that the Tribune is as transparent as it can be. Even that discussion of the transparency must have resonated with audiences exactly where they were sitting on the couch, because it feels as though it was a wide-ranging enough, layered approach that there wasn't anybody who couldn't relate to somebody in that particular episode.
Very well said.
Mm.
That is exactly right.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
that's what we aim for on the show, that multiple point of view held together by skilled narrative and characterizations. Because it doesn't work if it's just a screed, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You have to involve the audience in every character's personal involvement in the story. And that was the beauty of Lou Grant, is you had these very solid, recognizable, ongoing characters. You knew where they were coming from. You knew Rossi was going to be the union guy. You knew Billy was going to have integrity, and you knew Lou was going to be conflicted.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was one of the challenges of writing the show, was giving each character their own conflict. Mrs. Pynchon, owning the newspaper, is on the side of management, obviously. So she is going to have that point of view conflicting with her own heart. So there's a lot of richness there.
I do think, and I'm just going to put this out there as a spoiler because it's on YouTube, people. So listen to this whole very rich conversation with April Smith, who wrote this episode, and then go watch it with a whole different eye. Because I think if you were to watch Lou Grant Harassment without having a reason to watch it, you might get bored a little bit. You know, it was made 40 years ago. But the Mrs. Pynchon point I will make is that I got the definite twinge from her, a little bit like what we saw in Mrs. America, where Phyllis Schlafly is treated a certain way in a room full of men, and she doesn't like it, but she puts up with it. And all of a sudden, in a position of power, Mrs. Pynchon has the opportunity to make a difference, states it loudly, states it in her own leadership to her direct reports, namely Charlie Hume and Lou Grant. And this is how it's going to be. Now
That's right.
You could sort of say, well, I mean, is the reform in the form that she offers up in the form of some sort of a panel for harassment claims to be reviewed, is that strong enough? You could say in the moment of the day, that was better than nothing and better than many women would have gotten had the organization been led by men.
Very true. And that is the brilliance of having Mrs. Pynchon own the paper, is you do have her point of view. And I was thinking of the episode Strike, where she is all for keeping the status quo and keeping the paper going until she crosses a certain line and decides enough is enough. And spoiler alert, at the very end, she's the one who makes the deal. She hangs back and rolls with the strike and all its sad and tragic and uncomfortable consequences, until she realizes this is not good for the Trib and it's not good for the people that she supports and cares about. So she steps forward. She does have the ability, when she wants to just swipe those men out of the way and make a decision. So that's why we root for her.
She was a very inspiring character, and she was to a teenager, the idea that there were women like that who were that decisive and confident in their own skin and position, that was gratifying. I looked forward to those sorts of situations, not knowing for sure how my life would unfold.
Well, Nancy Marchand really just blew that role out of the water. She inhabited it, and she brought that power to it as an actor. She was the anchor. I mean, you think that Lou Grant was the anchor and Ed Asner was actually fabulous, of course, in the role. But she, as you say, was the quiet anchor, like the Queen of England. You know, she speaks, you listen.
Yes, and how she and Linda Kelsey as Billy Newman played against each other on a generational basis, on an ethical, and sort of even the two waves of feminism, let's say, because technically there should have been about a 30-year, maybe 25, 30-year age gap between the two of them. It's fascinating. So, April, in kind of dissecting what we think of today as the definitions of #MeToo, and you talked a little bit earlier about back in 1980, the quid pro quo, the idea that sexual harassment was only indicated if there had been an offer or a requirement that was then attached to keeping your job or perhaps receiving a promotion. That certainly is something that has popped up in recent years and has been modeled and been the part of many different criminal complaints throughout the media industry as well as almost every industry. So that does not come as necessarily news to people. But I think one of the sort of unsettling aspects of the harassment script that you wrote and how it was presented 40 years ago was that Billy Newman, as a young and up and coming professional journalist, at one of the nation's biggest newspapers, was a disbeliever. She didn't really believe that she had been the victim of harassment, and that if she had, well, she was strong enough to put up with it. When you watched this episode not that long ago, what did that make you feel?
I was surprised that she had that point of view, and Rossi was the one, the male reporter was the one arguing with her, but wait a minute, this isn't right. And I thought, wow, that was smart. Because then she started from that position as the disbeliever. And so she was your way into the story for the viewer to maybe change their mind about this whole issue, because you saw Billy, as she started interviewing people to find out what the situation was at her own workplace, you saw her change and you saw her new understanding of it. And that's the way it is in real life. You may be on the opposite side of something, and then it turns you around. So that's the optimism in the concept, actually, of reporting, is that it changes you. It changes you as a reporter, as a person, and it changes you as a viewer.
I believe it did change the viewers. You did a really great job of bringing Billy through that end of disbelief, having her learn in real life with people she worked with. Technically, she was in the same set of offices as these women who were bringing forth real examples and naming real names, and then backing off of their claims and their charges because of fear of retribution. And then what you do at the end, and I'm just going to say spoiler, is the heavy part, I guess, and that is that Billy was going to head off and take on the harasser of the hour. And so all of a sudden, and we don't really find out how that goes, but we know that she's got to be the smartest one in the room. She's got to be strategic in terms of how she presents everything about her experience with this guy, in the hopes of finally getting him what? Getting him fired, getting him exposed, having him confess that he's an abuser and a harasser or a perpetuator of toxic workplaces. And I felt bad because all of a sudden this became Billy's burden. And it was a woman having to fight for these other women in what was a workplace that sort of had taken on a sense of reform. But as you said earlier, no, there was still a lot of chuckling and catcalling. Did that strike you? Did you feel like in the end you probably put too much on Billy's shoulders?
No, because that was her role as the reporter. You're seeing it through her eyes. And one of the most, I think, important parts of her journey is when she starts to be empathetic toward these women. She listens to their stories. She takes the point of view of the viewer, hopefully, who might be skeptical going in. And as the men make excuses and, oh, we're just kidding and it doesn't matter. And, well, she's cute, so why not? You see Billy being with the pain that these women are in and their inability to articulate it. And then she articulates it by telling the story. That's the evolution of how these wrongs get publicized, is you need that first empathetic ear. And then the ability to translate it into words. It starts that way with reporters. So that's very true. I think one of the things Lou Grant did consistently was elevate the role of the writer as the empathetic listener who is the messenger of the story.
Listeners, recognize that in 1980 and 1978, when all of Lou Grant was getting developed, it was on the heels of not just Watergate, but also a recognition of the role that the press played, both print and TV press played, in exposing Watergate and opening up government and some of the transparency that was necessary that occurred as a result, in legislation. and reforms that were happening following Watergate. And so Douglas Daniel book talks a little bit about the fact that there had been so many other attempts at TV series that involved a newspaper or journalists, and they just failed consistently. And Lou Grant turned out to be that anomaly, in part because they kind of stuck to a really tight framework and had very talented writers like April Smith.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Getting back a little bit to the fact that one of the tenets, one of the aspects that was included in every episode was some social issues at a time when America was rapidly changing. Actually, the rapid change, here we are now, if you want to draw that corollary to Mrs. America, this would have been 2 years before the end of the extension of the ERA for ratification in the States. Mm-hmm. So there is already sort of perhaps what you might consider a peak in civil rights and the expansiveness that was going on. But you have this control, this power, and Mrs. Pynchon has this control within her newsroom to be able to show these male characters with very progressive storylines touching on social issues week after week. Did you sort of line them all up consistently? So in a spectrum of wokeness, shall we say, that Rossi was always the absolute most liberal, and who was the most conservative? Was it Charlie or was it Art Donovan? Help us understand a little bit about whether or not you kind of did some mix and match based on what the social issue was.
Well, the characters were consistent in their points of view. I think bottom line was what they contributed to the newspaper, which point of view they contributed to the newspaper. So I don't think it's so much their wokeness as their job, because that was the grounding principle in writing these scripts, the newspaper. So, Rossi would be aggressive to get the story. He's aggressive in the episode of Strike to support the union. Okay, that's part of his character, is the aggressiveness. But the way that it is manifested has to do really with what he's bringing to the paper. So I think that was the grounding principle of the characters. And the other word I would use with Lou Grant is integrity. The integrity of Lou and Charlie in terms of what is news, what's best for the paper, beyond politics and beyond their personal points of view. And that's where the conflicts come from. That's very relevant today. And the integrity on the show in the writer's room came from the top, from Gene Reynolds, who was a humanist. He cared about society. He cared about individuals. And he brought those values to the show. And that's luckily the way we were given the freedom to do that. That came first. The values and integrity of the way the characters acted in terms of their jobs, in terms of the paper, and the responsibility of journalism to be the carrier of truth, which even today the New York Times has to reiterate in every edition. The truth matters. Mm-hmm. When the truth is challenged by falsehoods that can't be validated, what do you rely on? You rely on the media. Mm-hmm. So a long time ago, 40 years ago, that was the principle that guided this show.
And listeners, you should know if you feel like the name Gene Reynolds sort of rings a bell, wasn't he one of the producers, longstanding producers of MASH?
Yes, he was one of the creators of MASH, and he was a child actor and a great director. So he brought that broadness of experience in making film to the room. It wasn't only ideas, it was production as well.
Mm-hmm. When we think about quality TV, and there would be some people who say that, categorizing something as quality TV is elitist or is purely subjective. It does create, though, a definition of a series of TV shows that did have some moral underpinnings on a consistent basis, and that created that nuanced, woven story that allowed you to see these multidimensional characters that had been created and were allowed to live over season after season after season. And that's why you watch them, is because they were superior. They were written in a way that was so captivating that you were hooked as a viewer. And I think that that's a little bit of what we miss in some TV today, and some TV is excellent. And it's probably one of the key things that separates for a discriminating viewer what is worth watching and what is worth an hour, or even if you're DVRing it and fast forwarding through commercials, your 50 minutes, give or take.
Well, right. I mean, viewers can tell what's true and get hooked on things they identify with. It's just we're not doing a civics lesson, we're doing drama. Mm-hmm. And the more levels to the drama, the more deeper response you're going to feel. That's what it's about. You don't have to be in a moral universe to talk about what's true on a human level. And that's, I think, what distinguishes drama from, popcorn. Mm-hmm. Like in Cagney and Lacey, okay, you're in the world of cops. But again, what makes it true is how these consistent characters respond to the situations they're put in and how they model their own integrity for the audience.
I would add that in addition to modeling integrity, which they do, and that was very purposeful, I think that you all were writing into that because that's how it should be. And those are values of not just the day of 1980 or 1986, whatever the series was, but also the values that at that time were really recognized as exemplary in this country. But you were also adding critical thinking, let's just say, and that mm-hmm. critical thinking also influenced the dialogue, that it was okay to question, it was okay to disagree, and mm-hmm. it was okay to do that within your team, recognizing that there was still a leader in the team and that a fact was a fact and mm-hmm. that data was good, science was good, and mm-hmm. a better decision was usually the outcome of the gathering of as much as you could to then inform the team and move forward. And that seems really obvious when I say it out loud, but I think that as represented in what people consumed week in and week out created better citizens.
Right. But let's not leave out the factor of art and skill in writing. Let's talk about writers for a moment.
Sure.
I don't know if viewers get it, that it all starts with the writers. And the actors follow along with what the writers have hashed out and thought about from every angle. There's good writing, like on Mrs. America, where every line you write has to be true to the character. And then there's lazy writing, which is a lot of sort of popcorn TV. Mm-hmm. So, when you're involved in a show and you can't stop watching, yes, there's plot, and yes, there's suspense, and yes, there are cliffhangers, but good writing is deeper than that. And you may not be aware of it, but it's the lifeblood of the drama. So writers are important. They're the first who put themselves in the position of the characters they write about. So they've gone through that journey for mm-hmm. you, and then made music out of it. You can tell the difference if you listen.
What a great way to end this conversation. April Smith, it has been a joy to have you and to just go really deep about the experiences you've had now writing over a couple different forms, I should say, genres. In our previous conversation, we dug in a little more deeply into how it is that you evolved into made-for-TV movies, and then, of course, your career as an author. You are indeed a writer, and it feels as though I can say that you're to the point of being a writer's writer, because you have been in so many different seats and succeeded at every opportunity.
Oh, Cynthia, thank you. And thank you for bringing this, into the public conversation.
You're welcome.
All of the things that you do for women as well as the medium of TV.
Thank you.
Your work is really valuable.
Thank you. So, Mrs. America, so I recall when we were having lunch in California a couple of years ago, and you said, well, I might have this opportunity and I'm really excited about it, and I can't tell you. Was that what was in the works 3 years ago?
It was. Oh. Do you believe that? Yeah.
It takes time. It takes a lot of time for these things to happen.
Well, yes, I know, because we were in the writer's room probably for 6 months. And then there was production for a year. And, these things, by the time when you see people and, knock on wood, go up and get Emmys, what their work was 3 years ago. It's lucky they still remember each other's names.
Right. And here I am asking you questions about an episode that happened 40 years ago. So
I know.
If we were in person, you would have just drilled me with a look of get away from me.
It's a challenge.
So I guess, so if it was 3 years ago and it was 2 years ago that you were in the writer's room, and I'm guessing that was a very consuming period of time. Has there been work on your novels? Are you going back to writing books?
Yes, I am. I have written a manuscript that we're going to check out for hopefully submission soon. Writing a novel, oh my God, talk about time. It's forever. It's a one-man band, and nobody really gets how long.
And when you're sheltering in place, you have no excuse, and the distractions are in your own hand. So what a great time for us to be celebrating your career. And as Mrs. America rolls out the contributions you've made in helping us better understand feminism as it's been presented in all forms on TV over the years. April, how do people follow you and all of your good work?
Well, you can go to my website, aprilsmith.net. And you can write to me at april@aprilsmith.net, which is on the website.
And listeners, we will include that in the show notes as well. April is also on Facebook. You have an author page on Facebook?
Yes, April Smith Books,
and
Facebook and Twitter.
And Twitter, yeah. She is not going away, and she is not slowing down, and has many more stories probably cooking in her brain as we speak. So, April, thanks so much for being on Advanced TV Herstory. Thank you.
It's my pleasure and privilege. Thank you, Cynthia.
Hey folks, thanks for listening to this episode of Advanced TV Herstory. It was great to have another connection with April Smith. A few notes from some of the things that we discussed and I mentioned. The book that Douglas K. Daniel wrote back in 1996 is entitled Lou Grant, The Making of TV's Top Newspaper Drama, published by Syracuse University Press. We mentioned at length the episode of Lou Grant that is available on YouTube, and it's called Harassment. April Smith was the writer, and that's the one we go in depth on. We also briefly discuss another award-winning episode called Strike. If you're looking for more information about April Smith or how to get a hold of her, go to aprilsmith.net, and included on her website are a full list of her books, including the FBI Special Agent Anna Gray series and her filmography. It's all very impressive. For more information about Advanced TV Herstory, go to our website, tvherstory.com, and there you will find ways to get a hold of us and track us on social media. You can roll through the archives of more than 110 episodes, including an earlier interview with April Smith before she got the Mrs. America gig. And then lastly, sign up for our e-newsletter. And yes, in your heart, we will not share your email information with anybody. Lastly, a big shout out to Catherine Yang for helping produce and edit this episode. And of course, our music brought to you by Jazzer, and it's called Take Me Higher, found at Free Music Archive. You know what, folks? Meeting cool people, whether they are April Smith or listeners of this podcast, and talking about how even 40 years later, 40 years after an episode airs, we can find an opportunity to recognize the important role that TV women make. And isn't that awesome? That's why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.